This podcast is produced by the team behind the Answered the Call, Australian History, How to Research, World War I, Australian Imperial Force Soldiers, 1914 to 1918 online course. If you're not sure where to start or find navigating websites confusing, this easy to use and practical online course will show you how to confidently research military sources, records, and more. Check out the course webinar at the hyperlink answeredthecall.mykajabi.com for the details of how you can reveal your family's fascinating military history. G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Bloom. Today's special guest is Adam Holloway, author of Duty Nobly Done, which tells the story of 11 men from his family who served in World War I. G'day, Adam. Welcome to the show.
G'day, Ad. How are you doing, mate?
Good, thanks, mate. Really good to have you on, mate. I'm
Thank you.
excited. I've been excited about this to have you on. So, basically, what I would like to do, Ads, is I'd like to get in and just ask you, what inspired you to start researching the military history of your family? Was it an interest in genealogy that initially sparked your interest, or was it something else?
Yeah, I've been interested in military history since I was about 13. I pretty much trace it back to being aware that my father was a Vietnam veteran, and I knew that my great-grandfather had been in the First World War. And as we normally do through English subjects at school, we watched Gallipoli. And it was pretty much from that time on, from about grade 7, grade 8, that I started to get an interest in military history, which sort of started off with World War II aircraft. I love the Spitfires, Lancasters, Flying Fortresses, and then into World War II. World War I it wasn't my main interest at the start, but it soon became an interest of mine through reading about, different aspects of the battles, through even just reading Biggles, because I like aircraft. So I read Biggles, and then bit by bit, it just started to build up in my mind as an interest, and I started to have it just really resonated with me. And it was probably around that time that I realised that there was more than one war. I thought it was just all one big war my dad had gone to, and then I discovered that it was several wars because we just don't learn. And then fast forward a bit, I went to France in 1999 to walk the battlefields, which was just fantastic. But like most people, you go there. Back then, the internet was in its infancy. We didn't have all the information we have now. So I sort of went there with just the basic information that my great-grandfather had fought somewhere in France. He'd been wounded. He'd been a Lewis machine gunner. I didn't even know which battalion he was in. And it wasn't until the mid-early 2000s where Dad found out about my great-grandfather had 2 other brothers and 8 cousins, all from the same grandparents. And that really awakened all my interest, all the reading and research I'd been doing. And I thought I'll do a small project where I'll just research all these 11 boys. And as I was doing that, it became quite clear that they were across a range of battalions, which allowed them to basically be in every single battle except 3rd Eep. From the first shots of Gallipoli to the end, some of my family were there. Sometimes it was one of the boys, sometimes it was 2 or 3. And the number of times from reading letters that they crossed paths and their battalions were side by side in battle, and a light bulb literally went on. I just thought, is there a story in this? And I began to really investigate that, and that was the origins of Duty Nobly Done. So yeah, I started writing that in late 2012.
Right, that's fascinating. So, at which point in your research did you make the decision to write the book about your family's service in the AIF, and why?
I think it was that time where I could see that there was probably a story to be told, that they were involved in so much, and that I was learning about different battles that I'd only heard the name of. And you grow up listening to all the same old cliches about the Australians did that and the British generals were this and that and the other. I know that my great-grandfather never had a good word to say about them, but I always like to make sure for myself if I'm going to have my own opinions. And when I was researching it, I just wasn't finding the evidence of that level of callousness that you always hear about. I mean, the British Tommies had this just as rough a time as the Aussies did. So I wanted to discover more about my family, but also what the Australians actually did. And through researching and reading about that, I discovered that I wanted to tell that story as well, about where the Australians, what they did beyond Gallipoli, beyond Pozieres and Villers-Bretonneux, that people, they know more about those Western Front battles now and Fromelles. But, you know, Bullecourt, it's becoming more known. But there's so many other battles that I was learning about and thought, well, the way I can tell the story of Australia and the Great War through my family, and it's just as applicable to anyone's family. And when I discovered Trove, with the digitised letters and then there were other letters and diaries and postcards that we came across, I decided to write it in a narrative style so that you're with the boys in the trenches, because I don't have the credentials of a Peter Hart who's got the runs on the board to write a book. So I couldn't just do a normal history. It had to be something different, and that's when I came across the idea to change it from just a normal history book to a narrative style, and that seemed to work well in conveying those battles and the experiences of my family. So, yeah.
So with the idea of you writing your book, were members of your family keen for you to write the family history on the boys? Was there a lot of support behind from your family?
Awesome question. I think it was it's a hard thing, because when you start something like that, you're not quite sure what it looks like, really. And believe me, when I first started, I did not envisage the size of the book or the length of time it would take. I was hoping to knock it over in a couple of years. And so finding that balance between family and life and writing the book was not always a successful battle. But I think now in hindsight, there's certain things I might have done a bit differently, but at the time I didn't know. In terms of support from the wider family, I didn't make it well known that I was writing it for that purpose, but when I was researching and asking people if they had any photos or letters or anything, I would just say, look, I'm looking to write an account of our family. Once it became clear that I was writing a book for public consumption, I made it very clear what I was doing. But even then, there were certain roadblocks with certain family members who felt that they had great rafts of letters from at least two of the boys, and they didn't really want to give them to me because they were their father's letters. And I do appreciate that, but they gave me some, which was lovely, which revealed a bit about the characters, so I could create each individual person. But there are instances where people I'd never met before and just met through Facebook or just through the usual inquiry channels, who just freely gave diaries, letters, photos, and it really added humanity to the whole project. And meeting people who were my great-granddad's best mate and went away on the same ship, and 100 years later we meet up again, it's just an amazing feeling. So I had a good wide support network of people who were keen and interested to see their relatives' stories told, my relatives. So it really was a great opportunity to meet new people and tell stories that hadn't been told in this particular way. I think that's what I wanted to do, was tell their story in a different way to what people are generally used to. So yeah.
So your book uses narrative style. Can you share what inspired you to adopt that approach as the best way to share the men's stories?
Yeah, I think that was the turning point, was Trove, was actually going beyond the facts and figures. and to give the books give a life of its own. As I sort of said before, with my lack of professional credentials, I know that you don't have to be an academic to love battlefield history. We know that. But when it comes to conveying things to the average person who may not be devoting their entire life to battlefield history, I felt that the best way to present the information and to enjoy the process myself was to write it in a narrative style. I felt more confident that my researching and my investigative abilities were up to the task of making sure it was accurate. But in terms of fleshing it out, giving it a pulse, helping drawing people in so that they're interested in the layout of the land or the way the battles unfolded, I think that was essential to write it in that way. And that thankfully occurred to me early in the piece. I didn't get halfway through the manuscript and go, actually, I want to write it a different way. I was very pleased that almost from the beginning that occurred to me. I pretty much ran with that the whole way, making sure that, so you'll get some, for example, some first-person conversation because I got that out of a letter. You'll generally get a feel for how the boys are tracking mentally, but also just the physical strain that they're under. I was very mindful, I think, too, also that, you need to make sure that the boys who go through several battles, they're changing as people as well. So you have to make sure that you're in that moment as you're writing, So I think that Trove again was incredibly helpful. Reading newspapers from 100 years ago helps you immerse yourself into that environment and the way they speak and what's important. And so being able to immerse myself in it also helps you write from that position as opposed to writing 100 years later what I think they might have been like. So I think that helped too. And again, the narrative style just lends itself well to if you like a good story, if you're not, I'm not real fussed on battlefield history or war history, but I like a good story, I think this could also appeal to a person who just likes a good story. Yeah.
Absolutely, I agree. And so for you in writing your book, did you have to go, obviously you once you found out how many family members served, what was your decision then to go and walk the ground again to get a perspective on the book?
Awesome question. I think, as we've said before, and you've said on your podcast, is that if you can, to get a genuine appreciation for what these books are about, what these stories are about, is to walk the ground. We're not talking huge distances that these battles took place over. And I think that's one of the things that strikes you when you go there and you think this is going to be taking place over a huge area. And when you go there, you discover it's 500 yards or 1,000 yards. And then you see the topography. It's just billiard table flat, or there's this barely perceptible rise, which is Pozieres Heights. And you're like, these are the heights? And then you think 10,000 men died between here and there. And then when you come home and you look down the end of your street and you think, that's 50 meters. And so I needed to get a real sense of the lay of the land so that I could write again from their point of view. And I think going back in 2012, I was able to step away from the memorials and the towns and get out into the countryside and actually to walk on the last bit of ground they walked on. I think it just makes it so much more poignant and allowed me to be a bit more vivid in my writing, because I was writing from a place of confidence because as you know, you've walked the ground many times. The shells and shell craters and everything's gone, but if you've got half an ounce of imagination and the battle and where everyone was, it comes to your mind. And I just wanted to be able to convey that in the book as well. So it was essential to walk the ground, and I think that really helped me add to the way that I wrote the book. So if you can, and again, it's a big if because it's a long way to go, and 12,000 miles and $12,000, it's all five-figure stuff. It's not good if you're, but if you can, it's an awesome opportunity. So I've been blessed to go twice.
I agree. If you do get the opportunity, to the listeners, you obviously, if you do get the time And like I've said in the podcast before, it's one thing to read it in a book. It's another thing to actually walk that ground, and you won't be sorry that you have walked that ground if you do get the opportunity to go. So while each man's story is special in its own right, Adam, was there one man or perhaps one family member that you identified with more than others, and why?
I think Frank Holloway. So the story starts with Frank. He's the first man to enlist in the town of Roma, where my family is from, in Western Queensland. And he had such a strong sense of duty, and I think he was second generation Australian too. And I think that's what people need to, and I hope I've achieved in writing the book, is giving people an idea of the type of mindset that led to this many men enlisting, even from just one small family, 11 young men, but just the amount of young people who enlisted from Australia. It's just a different mindset, and I think when you're first and second generation Australians, or even you were British born, which many of the original Anzacs were, the idea of empire and the king and serving the mother country, under this idea that we'd been protected and preserved by the fleet, the British fleet, the Navy. So you've got this mindset that says we've been doing our militia training, we've been cadets, we've been in the light horse or the infantry, and now here's an opportunity for you to give back to your empire, your king. And then all of a sudden, this sense of duty as well as adventure drives these young men to go off at first. And I think I love about Frank is that that's probably what's generating his initial interest, is that the originals, as you watch them progress through the war, they're a staunch bunch, because if it was only a sense of adventure that sent them, what kept them there? And for me, it's this sense of duty and this love for each other, and the unselfish way they go about what they do. And they're in this dirty business of killing. Frank was a photographer, and within 6 months of enlisting, he's running ashore at Gallipoli and he's bayoneting people. So, you go from being a photographer to basically a killer, and watching these boys unfold and just how they deal with that and accept what they have to do and what their new reality becomes. And I think for me, Frank and I see a lot of similarities in how I am with Frank, and the way he writes, the way he talks, and he responds to each situation. So I think for me, Frank's story is an awesome one. So he would be I think most people, when they read the book, enjoy Frank. The other one, which was, I know they were very good mates. Frank and Henry Holloway was one of my uncles is Henry, and his nickname was Chick, which was shortened from chicken, because he was afraid of nothing and no one. And he would be the sort of stereotypical Australian soldier that people would like Australian soldiers to be like. And I think people will enjoy following Chick through his adventures as well, because he and Frank are very different in a lot of ways. And I wanted to draw that out because they're both great leaders, but they're just different, have different styles. So I think Frank, and then probably Chick. But again, I just love all the boys. I just think, your heart just breaks for what every single one of those boys and the nurses all went through on a daily basis. And you just think, could I stand that for an hour, let alone days, weeks, months, and years? To just a different mindset, a different generation. And yeah, I've got nothing but love and admiration for them. I really do.
Absolutely. I agree. I agree 100%. What those men did, you can't put it into words, Adam. It's just one of those things that you just have to take your hat off to the bravery that the men that they did and that they faced. It was just, I think, and I might sound controversial here, but I think today's younger generations wouldn't put up with what these men did before us.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, and a lot of it comes down to knowledge and awareness. And I think people back then, they had more confidence in their politicians. They had more confidence in their leaders. They had more confidence in themselves and their own abilities. I think now people are too well informed, and back then it was like, oh, these things are worth dying for. Now you look around and you think, there's certain aspects of society where you probably question that. I think though, if you're under a direct attack, like in World War II, it was a different scenario, I think, that generated our war effort. And I think when you're more directly threatened, that might bring out a different response, perhaps. But I think the style of war that World War I was, again, you and I have read for decades, and I still can't comprehend what drove the fair dinkum and the deep thinkers and the war babies as they were all called, to, after all those casualty lists, after all those lost cousins and brothers, that they still were enlisting to go, that 11 of our men went.
Amazing.
I can't comprehend that. So they knew what they were going to, because a lot of people think, oh, they didn't know what they were going to. And the first contingent, maybe the second contingent, yeah, there's a certain element of that. But once you get to the Western Front and you see Fromelles and Pozières and Fleur, and you think to yourself, I still want to go. That's to me, that takes a lot of, that's a different kind of commitment and sense of duty right there. So I can't comprehend that.
Absolutely. So how do you think the experiences of your family's soldiers get a glimpse into what thousands of AIF soldiers endured? Like, why is that?
Well, I think because of the way that the battalions and the companies and platoons and sections were all set up, and the way they all fought in the same sort of battles and rotated through each battle zone, it gives people an idea of what their soldier would have been through. So, for example, like from your podcast the other day with Matt at Pozières, the number of times the Australians went through that sector in 6 weeks. So, the soldiers are all going through the same thing. So if you've got a 9th Battalion fellow and you don't know much about him, then if you were to read this book, it would give you an idea of what it was like to hop the bags on the 23rd of July when one of our boys was in that first battle and helped capture the village. If he was part of the 15th Battalion, then you will be able to understand what it's like to come into the line under a heavy barrage where the Germans are basically shelling you every 2 or 3 seconds, and then come into a position at before Mouquet Farm, where the parapet is constructed of dead Germans and the ground underneath your feet is spongy, and the aroma is so bad that people are chain smoking till their throat and nose burns. And then if you're 26th Battalion, you're at the windmill, and all of a sudden you're starting to get a glimpse of what your great-granddad, your great-granduncle, who was 26th Battalion, 25th Battalion, 9th Battalion, 24th Battalion get a mention, the 4th Battalion. So I think, the way I've written it is to make sure that there are as many ways possible to help anyone. You could put your fellow's name into that book instead of Frank and say, I know that my great-granddad was at Gallipoli. What was it like? Well, you read what Frank went through, and guess what? Your great-granddad's experience will be very similar, if not the same. So I think it's not just for my family, it's as much for anyone who has a relative who fought in the Great War. So I wanted to make sure that lots of stories were told through the whole thing, and being able to draw on the battalion war diaries and the letters from friends and other mates in the same battalion also helps to achieve that. So I think that would help people understand it a bit better about why their great granddad was the way he was when he came back.
Absolutely. So your book personalizes the experiences of your family. Was one of your goals to help your readers gain a better understanding of what the soldiers in their families experienced?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I wanted to make sure my family understood, and then in the wider arc of things, what other people, relatives went through. And a really great example of that was during the research phase. One of my chaps was in a position moving through some trenches when they were under some heavy fire, and he was buried alive several times, but managed to be dug out, thankfully. He kept carrying on. He was told to go to the rear, get some attention, have a swig of rum and just clear his head for a bit. He refused, wouldn't quit his post, and he kept going and going. And then the commanding officer, he got buried again. His commanding officer said, "Off you go." And he's like, "No." And then probably half an hour later, his commanding officer and 3 other men were buried alive. And he raced, despite all the shelling, despite a sniper trying to clean him up. He raced out and dug all 4 of them out by hand, and saved 4 men's lives, including his commanding officer. If his commanding officer had been successful in ordering him back, he would not be alive. So he stuck around, he pulled him out, and that commanding officer had a serious head wound, and he was sent back to Australia, where he had a family that grew up, and all they knew about him was that he'd been wounded in the war. And as luck would have it, through my inquiries and investigations, I was able to meet his descendants and tell them the story of how one of my boys saved his life, and they're alive today because of that. I'll tell you what, mate, if you want hairs on the back of your neck to go up, that's a great moment, because I was able to show them a photo of my fellow that saved their boy's life, tell them the full story. So in terms of being able to, tell people significant events from their family, like, I couldn't think of a more significant event than you're alive today because of the fortunes of war. My boy just happened to be there at that time, and earlier in the day, there were blokes from his platoon who pulled him out. And that's what it came down to, that they were there for each other, they fought for each other, and I'm lucky to be here, quite frankly. My great-granddad, I still can't comprehend how he was able to survive some of the stuff he went through. So you'll probably note, and your listeners will note, that I'm not using people's names as I say all this, because the way I have written the book is so that you don't know. You don't know. You're going through everything they're going through. And if you knew who survived, then you wouldn't get that same experience. So for me, when people say, "Who's your great-granddad?" or "Who lives and who dies?" I just say, well, you'll have to read and find out, because if I tell you, then it just becomes another history book.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that's why I tell you.
Absolutely. No, I like it. I like it. There's with the book, Adam, there's a mystery behind it, which is always, it keeps the reader engaged and wanting to keep reading to find the ending out. I think it's great.
Yeah.
What were the major obstacles or difficulties that you experienced in writing Duty Nobly Done, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I think I sort of touched on it at the beginning, where I think getting that balance right between family and writing. Again, I would just plead ignorance on that one, that I didn't know how it was going to unfold or what it would entail. My intentions were pure. I think finding the time, but also the creativity. So available time and creativity very rarely come together nicely. So you might have 3 hours to write, but if your brain and your heart aren't working, then that 3 hours can be just researching or doing something completely different. And then later on, the words just come out and just start pouring out, and you've got to sit down and just start typing. And there was many times where I was not in a position to do that, and that was frustrating. I think the length of time that's passed and and the resources that are available from, say, friends, family, and mates of the boys was a big obstacle. But then you could overcome that to a certain degree with Trove. Having the digitised newspapers was amazing. War Memorial with their digitised and scanned in documents. What we couldn't find there, we actually went to the War Memorial research rooms and spent 3 or 4 days. My dad and I, we went down there together, and all we did was just basically photograph and take notes for 4 days at the War Memorial, and they were just great. The staff were great. We would just give them a list of all the sort of folders and files that we wanted, and they'd bring us out 2 or 3. We'd go through those. I wouldn't say it was enjoyable because you're just there. It's all business. You're just trying to race through and get everything done. But later on, you get to go through it and you see all these different things that unfold. I just think, and then just having the patience, I think, was something I had to overcome a few times where I just wanted it to be done. I just wanted to get through it. And there were a few times where I thought to myself, can I do this? This has unfolded now to the point where I'm going to go from the first day of the war through the last day. And this is going to be a big undertaking. And there were 2 occasions where I actually had to put it aside because I had immersed myself into it to a degree where it was becoming a bit too hard on occasion. So it's just separating yourself from writing a century ago to coming back to the present world was an obstacle too that I had to be aware of and overcome. So being mindful of that. And then I think the last one too, when you're writing, is the editing phase. And I think I'm very thankful that from being an investigator for so long that I have a level of objectivity which allowed quite a number of words to come out during the editing phase. So it wasn't as big an obstacle as I thought it would be, but it definitely is. You know, you spend a lot of time writing and getting to know these boys and getting your facts right. And it's hours and hours and hours. And then in the stroke of a key, it's deleted and taken out. And that can be hard to take sometimes. But I was blessed with a great editor. Kathy McCulloch was great. And having Big Sky Publishing support me and think that the story was worth telling, that the book was something they wanted on their shelf, I'm very grateful for the support I had through there as well. So, yeah.
It's a great account of you, and for telling the listeners, Adam, of if they've got a unique story that they are interested in writing, it gives them an insight into how it's not easy to become an author. It really isn't, and I take my hat off to you, mate, because it's hard work. It's not easy, and I really think you've answered that question really, really well. So for those of your family soldiers who survived, what were their lives like after the war? Yeah.
So that was a tough part to write because of when you're researching them, the repatriation records are very good too. They're very detailed and they outline, the various medical episodes they have. And also their requests for pensions and what they used to call sustenance, which was like, I guess, like welfare at the start. When they first came back, they were well-meaning government schemes like the Soldier Settlement Scheme, which probably it couldn't have comprehended with the level of repatriation it had to address. Like over 300,000 soldiers returning, and what were they going to do with them? Some of their jobs were no longer there, and they came up with the idea of soldier settlement, putting blokes who'd never been farmers in their life on land which was unfarmable, and basically, if that's a word, I'm sorry, and then just watching their lives disintegrate after that. I think from my family's point of view, it's quite a mixed bag as to how each of them responded, and depending on whether they were wounded or not. Most of them got in the way of something, some of them more than others, and it is interesting to watch how their lives unfold as they deal with their wounds and their experiences. And at least 2 of them resort to alcohol. as a means to address what we would call probably post-traumatic stress disorder back then. I mean, one instance now in this day and age, and it's PTSD. Over there, 4 years of living in hell. Coming back would be quite a shock to the system coming back here. So alcohol was a major factor. And then even with the alcohol, one of them was a happy drunk and the other was an aggressive drunk. So it was very unpleasant to be around. And then just following them through as each of them, take their final roll call. The end of the book has an epilogue. So most of the readers are wondering after that last chapter, what happens to these guys? And so I give you a brief overview of what they went through. Some of them, it was like water off a duck's back. Seriously, they just got back on with their lives again and just kept rolling through. And for others, it just haunted them to their last days. Again, the last chap to die out of the 11, or the ones that came back, in the last moments, the repatriation records record how he's, in and out of consciousness, and and they actually write this, he's in the 1914-18 period. In his last moments of his life, he regressed back to that awful 4-year period. That was his last thoughts, the last words were things that were happening to him all that time ago. And you just think that's how significant that was, and that's how they could never get over it. They could never, ever truly get over it. And till the day he died, it was always with him. So, yeah, I think but it gives you a good understanding too. Sorry to give you a long answer to a short question.
That's all right.
But it also gives you an understanding. I know that on my mother's side, we had a great uncle, and he was described as a very unpleasant person. And they knew he'd gone to the war, and he actually joined up when he was 15 years and 8 months old. And he was at Gallipoli just after his 16th birthday. And 2 weeks later, he'd been shot and wounded, and he eventually got to France, and he'd been wounded to the point where he could never have children. And so his was an unhappy life, and unfortunately it infected everyone around him. And no one really understood until I started to research him and find out what he'd been through. And I was able to tell people, not that it condones certain types of behaviour, but at least you can have a bit of an understanding, where is this coming from? What has this guy been through for this to happen? And I think that's important too, that we remember what these boys went through, not just what they've done and what they've achieved, but what they experienced, to help us understand how that affected them, how it affects our young men and women now today, because we ask them to go and do an awful job and then try and judge them by society's normal standards. That doesn't match up. So that's what I took away from writing the book, was just getting a better understanding of why we are the way we are and where we're at.
No, I think you've answered that very, as you said, even though it was a long response, I think you've answered it brilliantly, mate. I really do. So, to wrap up, what projects are you working on currently?
Okay, so unfortunately I'm going to go down the rabbit hole of writing again. So I didn't learn the first time, but I've got a couple of ideas about a couple of other books. I also have Battlefield Investigations, which is just I just love making sure that people know about what their family did, and finding out great stories and telling them and helping people walk in their footsteps. I know that travel has been something that hasn't been happening in the last 6 months and may not for another 6, but being able to help people walk in their footsteps has been a real passion of mine. So, finding last resting places or the vicinities of where people have fallen, they might have no known grave. That's been something I've enjoyed doing for many, many years. So I've been doing that a bit more lately. And then, I think just focusing on my family and getting that, making that a priority. I mean, I know that the 11 boys are happy that their story's been told, but I know even they would say that my duty, my role now is to make sure that my family are taken care of as well. So I think, that's just being a good dad and being a good husband is one of my main projects.
And it's probably the most important project of all. So, and we should, Adam and I, we've got a special announcement to make that one of our lucky listeners, Adam, has given me a personally signed book of Duty Nobly Done, and one of the lucky listeners, you will be receiving that book. So I've got to work out how I'm going to draw out the lucky winner. But a special thing from Adam was given to me, and I will give one lucky listener a signed copy of Duty Nobly Done. So it's just Adam's little gift to me, and it's my gift to you guys, the listeners. So on that note, Adam, I think it's a great way to end the show, and thank you for telling your story of Duty Nobly Done and why you wrote the book. So Adam, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you for all the great work you're doing too, mate. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast.